Hello and welcome to the Answers Yes podcast. Thanks for tuning in. I'm going to slide this show in between a whole bunch of other interviews that I've done that will be coming out soon. And the reason why is I just went to the grocery store and bought basically nothing and rang up $100 worth of, flour, bread, chips. I didn't even have any alcohol in the cart. And I walked out of the store thinking, how are people going to afford the inflation that we're starting to experience right now? And I don't even have to talk about the gas prices because we're all looking at the gas prices go up. Literally, somebody sent me a message the other day, said, grab some gas tonight. It's going to go up tonight by tomorrow, at least a dime. And it did, even here in Montana. And, you start to see people posting on Instagram and other places about their price of gas. I know California, it's over $6. I saw a trucker post in Tennessee, filled up his tank. It was over $1,000. And he made a point to say, yeah, this is what it takes to fill up the truck. He goes, but you know what's behind me? And he pointed to the reefer running the cold air in his trailer. And he says, there's milk in that reefer, and it takes diesel to run that reefer cooler. He goes, that milk's going to be $10 a gallon by the time it gets you. What are you going to do? And that really hit home. Luckily here in Montana, we've got a local dairy farm, and we get milk locally, which it doesn't have to hit a truck like that. But I feel for what's happening in the country. And some of you know I help produce a podcast for my good friend John Fuller, who's in the state legislature here in Montana. And John and I just recorded a podcast this morning. He did all the heavy lifting because he's the speaker. But he talked about inflation. And I think it's so important for us to understand what inflation is, how it affects us, and where it is going. And maybe, if we can look into the future, what we can do about it right now. So I've got John Fuller here live in the studio. John, thanks for doing another show today.
Oh, well, thank you for having me there, Jim. You were talking about the rising fuel prices. I have a friend sent me a picture of a gas station that said the price was said unleaded regular, arm, unleaded premium leg, diesel, both.
Yeah. I think they've got loan applications now at the pumps just to get a full tank of gas.
Yeah, and then I saw another one of a guy. He was sitting there and he was filling his tank, and he was sitting there in a lounge chair watching. He says, and the little underneath it said, "Fuel is so expensive now, I can't afford cable, so I watch the news free while I'm filling up my tank."
Oh my gosh! Well, there's some truth to that. You know what's sad about this situation? Gas is the easy target because we fill up on our way to work or to get somewhere, and the dollar amount is right there. The dollar per gallon, you can't miss it. But when you go to the grocery store, and if you're like probably most of us, I know this is me, I fill my cart up with the things I need. I'm not necessarily looking at what a loaf of bread costs every time I grab that same loaf of bread or the cheese. You might make notice of it, but really it doesn't resonate like the gas. But when you get to the checkout and it's $100 and you got, two small bags of stuff, all of a sudden you start to realize things are going up and quick.
Yeah. Well, Jim, you just also illustrated the difference between guys and girls, or husbands and wives. Husbands buy and wives shop. Okay, so but yeah, the reality is that rising prices, in order to have a prosperous economy, we have to have reliable, cheap energy.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter whether the energy is hydrocarbon based. The common expression is fossil fuels. There's no such thing as fossil fuels. Oil doesn't come from fossils. It comes from hydrocarbons.
Yeah.
Okay, it's a pet peeve of mine. But it doesn't matter whether the energy is hydrocarbon or whether it is wind or whether it is solar or hydro. The fact remains is that an economy is based on a reliable, cheap energy. And right now, of course, we see energy prices accelerating even for the highest at the highest rate is even 40 years. For instance, according to the Biden inflation numbers that I just saw yesterday, inflation this month was 7.9%, the highest since 1980. Uh, so that brings up the topic: what exactly is inflation?
Yeah.
Everybody talks about inflation. What is it? Well, the answer is rather simple. There's too much money chasing too few goods. And so in inflation in itself, it can be fueled, if you'll pardon the pun, by two things. One is an increase in the monetary supply. And by golly, our government is passing out money hand over fist. And secondly, a decrease in the goods supply. And of course, in the case of American energy, we have an administration that has deliberately constricted the energy supply of America. 15 months ago, America was energy dominant in the world, and now we are energy dependent. In just that a little over a year, well, it happened in less than a year, because of policies of our government. It's almost as if the Biden administration is determined, to punish Americans uh, uh, for our values, if you will, regarding energy. And so the question then comes is, where is this going to go? How bad can inflation get? And being a historian, the legislator most likely to give a history lesson with every speech. Of course, the things that can happen is everybody brings up the example of what happened to Germany in the 1920s. That's called what happened to Germany was hyperinflation. Let me give you some statistics of what happened to Germany. In December of 1921, a loaf of bread in Germany cost 4 marks, which was about the same as $1 in America, about $4, 4 marks to the dollar in December of 1921. Exactly 1 year later, in December of 1922, in Germany, a loaf of bread cost 163 marks. And therefore, and less than a year later, in November of 1923, are you ready for this? This boggles the mind. A loaf of bread in Germany of November of 1923 cost 201 trillion marks. Trillion with a T. I'm not even sure how many zeros that is anymore. Okay, so what happened? What happened to Germany that it led to this hyperinflation? And what are the lessons for America? Well, first let me give you a quick little history lesson on what happened. Germany's troubles began with World War I. Germany had an enormous war debt, but Germany deliberately planned on having its defeated enemies pay for its war debt. It was going to make France and Russia and Britain pay for the war debt Germany had. Oops. Well, Germany didn't win that war. And so after being defeated, Germany discovered that not only were they going to have to pay their own debts, but the Allies, England, France, and the United States, told Germany that Germany was going to have to pay the Allies' debts. Uh-oh. And so what is Germany to do? Okay, well, governments pay for wars in basically 3 ways. They increase taxes, they borrow, like selling bonds, sort of thing, and then they print money. Okay? Well, the Allies told Germany after World War I that they were going to have to pay their debt to the Allies in foreign currencies, so Germany couldn't just print the money. And so, talk about a catch-22. Germany was, and of course, particularly France was fine with this because they hated Germans so much. Germany is faced with the idea that they had to buy foreign currencies, and they couldn't buy foreign currencies by printing money, so they had to borrow money to buy foreign currencies to pay the debt. And the vicious circle continued. Well, hyperinflation resulted. Compounding the problem, making the hyperinflation even more warp speed hyper, the German government was controlled by liberal socialists who started a huge social welfare spending campaign, despite the fact that they had an enormous debt. Does this sound familiar?
Very.
Okay. And let me give you some more statistics. In June of 1922, it took 493 German marks to buy $1. In June of 1923, exactly 1 year later, it took 109,966 German marks to buy $1. And only 5 months later, in November of 1923, it took 2.5 trillion marks to buy $1. Well, why in the world would governments ever engage in policies that would lead to inflation? Well, we have to face a little political reality here. The reality is that inflation has winners and losers. By definition, inflation means that money decreases in value. Salaries decrease in buying power. Savings are wiped out. Okay? Those are losers. But there are winners. Who are winners? Well, let's say you owed money to someone. And during inflationary times, the money you pay back will be worth less than the money you borrowed. In other words, the money you pay back will buy less than the money that you borrowed. And so the winners of inflationary times are those that have real assets, commodities, food, real estate, because they have increasing values. But here's the lesson. Inflation is very difficult to control. It's like a roller coaster going downhill. A big roller coaster is very difficult to slow it. And hyperinflation, as the kind Germany had, leads to complete social breakdown. So what did Germany do? Well, what Germany did was very painful. And this is the lesson to history here. Coming out in inflationary times will be and is painful. To stop the hyperinflation, Germany completely restructured its currency. It issued a completely new mark. It was linked to the gold standard, and it ended the hyperinflation, but it had enormous cost, incredible unemployment, and it increased the radical fringe political groups, the communists on the one hand and the fascists on the other extreme, and we all know where that left. And it destroys a distrust in popularly elected governments. People look to tyrants. So what are our lessons? To me, the lessons are very clear, because America is engaging. We are on the edge of a precipice. We are on the edge of an abyss here. Our economy is right here, perched on the edge of the cliff. We have what's known as fiat currency. When the government, and by the way, most governments of the world today have fiat currencies. What you look at any dollar bill or any paper denomination, there's this phrase printed on it. It says, "This note is legal tender for all debts, public and private." That is a fiat from the government. A government dictate that you have to accept this. Okay, and so when governments have fiat currency, they can determine its value by whatever they do, by things that they